everybody, welcome to another episode of Off the Shelf. Today we are going to be talking about our October theme for the 2021 EAPL Reading Challenge, which is the Great Outdoors. So the Great Outdoors in this case is anything having to do with nature. Maybe a book is largely set outdoors, maybe there's just a lot to do with some aspect of nature. It's pretty broad. There's a lot of fiction that falls into this category, but there's also a lot of nonfiction. And most of what I picked for you today is nonfiction. And I have to tell you, I don't think I've ever had a list where there were more books that I wanted to read but haven't had a chance to yet. So let's get started. We're gonna start out with the fiction because I've only got two of them. The first one is Salvage the Bones by Jesmyn and this actually won the National Book Award for Fiction in 2011. It takes place over about 12 days before Hurricane Katrina hit landfall in Mississippi. And it's set in a small coastal town in Mississippi and follows the lives of a poor family. The father is largely absent, there is no mother, and these kids are having to kind of scrape by while preparing for the impending hurricane. And it's beautiful and heartbreaking, and hurricanes are part of the great outdoors. So if you have not read this book, I absolutely recommend it. But it's not a happy read. And next I have a classic for you, Moby Dick by Herman Melville, which is the story of Ahab and his obsession to find the whale who attacked his ship and bit off his leg. So the narrator Ishmael tells you this story, and I think a lot of people are familiar with Moby Dick in theory, but I don't think really that many people have read it. So if you haven't read it, like me, then maybe we should all read it because it is absolutely a classic, even though it was out of print before Herman Melville even died because it didn't sell well enough to warrant another printing. But now it's widely considered one of the greatest books about the sea ever written. D.H. Lawrence said that it was the greatest book of the sea ever written. So if you haven't read Moby Dick, definitely give that one a look. And then I've got a bunch of nonfiction for you here. We have Alive, 16 Men, 72 Days, and Insurmountable Odds by Piers Paul Reed. And this is the story of a Uruguayan Air Force plane that was carrying a team of rugby players that went down in October of 1972 in the Andes. And I mean, that just sounds bad to begin with, but it took 10 weeks for rescuers to find them. And by then, obviously, there weren't a ton of them left. The survivors were trying to help one another, but at the same time, when people were dying, they were having to still survive. So, you know, doing some stuff that you don't like to think about. You don't want to eat your friends. But it's just, this is a crazy story. So if you're unfamiliar with the story, absolutely read the book, learn about it. I think you're gonna have a hard time putting this one down. And we have The Lost City of Z by David Grann. And this actually was turned into a movie several years ago. I wanna say it's on Amazon. Don't quote me on that. But it is about Percy Fawcett was an early 20th century explorer. I feel like that time frame just had so many men who were like, I'm gonna go explore the world. And they found funding for these trips and went out to explore something. But Percy Fawcett was really, really invested in finding what he called the lost city of Z. And it was in supposedly a jungle. And he and his team in 1925 set off to find it. And then they went missing, and no one ever heard from them again. And in more recently, I don't know exactly when, but the author, David Grann, came across a bunch of diaries and was fascinated by this story. And so he then became obsessed with trying to figure out what happened to Fawcett and his expedition. And I'm like, the 20th century exploration thing, it's amazing. Like, this spirit of exploration, I just can't get over. But if you are in for a story of obsession and mystery and intrigue, then this one is definitely for you. And then we have Welcome to the Goddamn Ice Cube, Chasing Fear and Finding Home in the Great White North by Blair Braverman. And this is sort of memoir-ish. By the time she was 18, Braverman had moved to Arctic Norway and later to Alaska. She's originally from California, but she wanted to learn to drive sled dogs and become what's the word? Not a survivor. She wants to be a tough girl. She wants to prove her resiliency and all of that by learning to live in the frozen north. At the same time, she has some imposter syndrome happening. She really feels like she is far less prepared than everyone around her. And this is her story of how she became better prepared, but also all of her own failings. And so if you are intrigued by, the North, or you just like those sort of stories of personal triumph, like overcoming adversity, then this is absolutely one to check out. If you do a Google search on books about the outdoors, like, this one is all over the place. People have talked about this book at length on the internet. Then something a little bit different, I have Haunted Hikes, Spine-Tingling Tales and Trails from North America's National Parks by Andrea Lankford. And Lankford was a park ranger, so she has a lot of that knowledge and expertise about the parks. And she includes all of the relevant information about the actual hikes themselves, like how difficult they are. There's maps, all of that stuff that you need to know when you're gonna take a hike. But then she tells stories of unsolved murders and ghosts and hoaxes and curses and all these other things. And since it's October, I thought we absolutely needed to include some haunted hikes in this. So while the weather is still nice, take this, read about some haunted hikes, and maybe go on one or two yourself. And then we have The Sixth Extinction, An Unnatural History by Elizabeth Kolbert. And in this, she talks about the 5 previous big extinctions on Earth and how each one dramatically changed what life looked like on Earth. And then talks about how we are in the midst of creating our own extinction as humans. So obviously we all know that we have irretrievably altered our planet just by living here. And I'm not even saying, be thinking about your carbon footprint and all that stuff. Just living on Earth, humans have altered the planet. Obviously, if you keep up with any news at all, there's a lot of scientists saying that that's rapidly increasing and we are in a bit of a crisis. And that's kind of what Kolbert's talking about here, is that we are really setting ourselves up for another mass extinction. So this is a fascinating read. It's not very long. I think you will just like tear through it if that's something that already interests you. So check it out. I am fascinated by this story. I have to read this book, The Feather Thief by Kirk Wallace Johnson. So in 2009, this concert flutist left a concert that he had performed at, got on a train, went to the British Museum of Natural History, and stole a bunch of birds, dead birds, and just made off with them. And the reason for this was because the feathers from these birds were highly prized for fly fishing, like fly tying, which, what? Like that would have never even occurred to me that that was a thing and why someone might steal dead birds. But then a couple of years later, the author was fly fishing and he was out with a guide, and the guide was telling him about this heist, and he had to know more. He had to know what happened next. Was the thief actually caught? You know, like what happened to the birds? All of this stuff. So if you like a good heist story, then definitely check this one out. You know, if you like fly fishing, you probably would be interested in this one too. But like I said, I am super fascinated by this story, and I'm absolutely taking this one home. So you're gonna have to wait till I'm done before you can read it. Books are getting away from me here. And we have Two Trees Make a Forest by Jessica J. Lee. And this one is another sort of memoir where the author explores her own family's history through landscape. So her family moved from China to Taiwan and eventually to Canada. A lot of people did that. There's a large number of Chinese Canadians, and her family is part of that community, but she kind of intertwines her own family history with the history of Taiwan and its terrain. And I say this all the time, it's fascinating, but it is. I think this is a really interesting approach to your own history and a way to view it through a different lens. So if you like sort of memoir and, you know, personal histories and family histories, this is a beautifully written book. The language is very, very, it's just beautiful. So check that one out. And then last one for you here. This one's a bit more of a tome. This is Cadillac Desert by Mark Reisner. And this actually came out in, I want to say 1986. I can tell you. Let me look at the copyright date real quick. Yep, 1986. So this came out in 1986, and obviously it was relevant at the time. I would argue that it is more relevant now than it was 30 years ago. It talks about the American West and the quest for water. As people moved west, there are fewer sources of water naturally the further west you go in this country. Things become much drier, much more arid, and while there are absolutely rivers and lakes and what have you, with the large population centers that grew up there, you have a lot of demand for water that's very, very hard to meet. And in Southern California in particular, the people that really are responsible for LA's population boom were touting it as this tropical oasis and all of this, while the water for all of that landscaping, first of all, and then for all of the people that live there, was being diverted from other places and other communities. And so there were agricultural areas that suddenly their water was going to LA instead of onto their fields, and they became, dust bowls instead of having the water to grow the things that historically they did, because that was their natural climate. Southern California, for the most part, is not a tropical climate, and none of it's a tropical climate, but most of it's at least semi-arid, if not straight up desert. So I think that's important to remember. I think there has been in the news recently talk about the Colorado River, which provides water to millions of people, and how there's not enough water there. And I think it's easy to forget, living where we do, where we have so much more water. I mean, right here at the library, we're like at the intersection of two good-sized rivers, and we get a lot of rain every year, comparatively speaking, and water is just not something that we have to think about to the same extent. And Cadillac Desert really gives you the chance to think about how much more important water is in the western part of this country. There are other books that are more recent that also talk about that. So if you read that one and you need to know more, there are other really, really good books on that topic. But I think it's an important topic. I'm a little bit biased because I grew up in the western states. I lived several years in Southern California, so I already know a lot about this, but it's an important topic and I think everyone should be aware of it. Okay, I'm off my soapbox now. Some of my coworkers have joked that we should name these videos Erin's Soapbox instead of Off the Shelf, because sometimes I get off on a little tangent. I apologize, I just can't help myself. But those are the books for the great outdoors. I think that you're gonna have a really easy time finding a book that fits into this theme. And I think if you are not normally a nonfiction reader, that you will still find something in nonfiction, if you give it a chance, that will really draw you in. So as always, try something new, try something a little bit different. Hopefully one of these caught your eye, intrigued you a little bit, except for the Feather Thief, because that one's mine. But until next time, happy reading.